It was huge, and it was terrifying, and it was coming straight for her. It appeared to be some kind of ungodly hybrid of bear and dog, but it was bigger than a house, and it had huge yellow fangs, which were dripping with the blood of its last unfortunate victim. The only part of it that wasn't black were its eyes, which were fiery red. It was really strange. Rachel couldn't, for the life of her, figure out how she'd got here. Just a second ago, she'd been buying worms from a laughing clown, as one does on any normal day, and then she was just here, being chased down the street by this thing. She ran as fast as she could, screaming and crying out to the people who were lining the streets, begging them to help her. But nobody did. Why were they all just standing there like that, open-mouthed and staring? What the hell was wrong with these people? Even if they don't want to help me, she thought, surely they want to get away from the giant monster that's about to trample them to death. Then she noticed the beast was running right through them, and that's when she realized that nobody else could see it. It was just for her. Well, how special. Suddenly, even though it was about midday, the sun went down and everything became dark. Rachel found herself standing at the very edge of a high cliff that dropped away in front of her and on either side, so that whichever way she turned, she faced a sheer drop straight down to foamy, turbulent water. She could hear the beast growling behind her, but she didn't want to turn around. She would rather jump than face that monster. So that's just exactly what she did. The instant she felt the beast's hot breath on the back of her neck, she leapt into the air and began the long fall down to the jagged rocks and raging water below. At this point, Rachel woke up in a terrified cold sweat. She was sure she could still hear growling in the darkness. One of her arms was poking out from under her blanket, and she really wished it wasn't, but she didn't dare move it. The only thing she could move were her eyes, which were opened wide in terror and kept darting from one dark corner of her bedroom to another every time she heard the slightest noise. By moving her eyes to the very tops of their sockets and giving herself a headache in the process, she could just make out the time on her bedside clock. 3:30. Well, great. That meant it wouldn't get light for hours yet. Oh, she wished she could turn on the light, but that would mean getting out of bed, which was unthinkable. She could call out for Mum, but no, that would mean giving away her position, equally unthinkable. She knew this was stupid, that it had just been a bad dream, but that thought didn't provide much comfort. She was still convinced that the beast was hiding in the shadows, waiting for her, ready to pounce the instant she moved or made a sound. Now she was starting to sweat, which was very odd, considering she was freezing. The arm that was out of the blankets was covered in goosebumps. Oh, how she wished she could move that arm. Logically, she knew it was silly and childish, but she also knew that she would feel much safer with her arms under cover, as though the blankets could provide an impenetrable barrier against the horrors that were lurking in the dark corners of her room. Oh, what a night that had been. Rachel had not been able to get back to sleep at all, and instead she just lain awake for hours, unable to move or make a sound, until the sun had begun to rise at last and she finally felt safe. Well, more than 20 years had passed now since that first time, but the dream always returned whenever she was feeling particularly stressed or depressed, so that over the last couple of years, she had dreamed it almost every night. Obviously, she was much better able to cope now than she had as a child, but the dream still disrupted her sleep and had taken over her waking life now too, as the beast occupied almost every thought. Until now, at least. Now, that dream had become the least of her worries. Her whole life had become a nightmare now, and she was almost positive where the blame lay. It was that fateful day 4 years ago when she had first met Belinda. That had been the point where everything had started to go wrong. Rachel always tried to look for the positive in every situation, and she had to believe that there was a reason for everything. It was the only way she'd been able to get through the torment she had had to endure at school. This time, however, she was really struggling to find anything positive. She supposed that she had learnt some lessons, the most important one being that you should be careful what you wish for. She could see the irony of it all, but it didn't particularly amuse her. She really did have everything she had wished for. She had wished for freedom, and now she had it. The ultimate freedom. She could do whatever she liked whenever she felt like it, because the only person she had to answer to was herself. No husband, no children, and she was down to one friend now. She had wished that she could hold down a job forever, and now here she was, stuck for all eternity in hell, working for the devil herself. Because unfortunately for Rachel, the universe is always listening. Always. The problem is that she only listens to the words we say, and all too often those words don't even come close to reflecting what's really in our hearts. Well, there was only one option left to Rachel now. There was no other way she would ever escape, and she had thought of little else for the past week. Now the plan was set, and it was time to do it. But first, she had to get these words right. She sat alone as usual, looked around herself at all the discarded paper, and thought it should not be this difficult to find the right words. But it had to be perfect. She wanted to make sure that anyone who read this letter would be left with absolutely no doubt as to who was responsible for all of this. 10 minutes ago, before she had begun to put her plan in motion, she had been positive that she knew exactly who that person was. Surely the blame rested squarely and solely on the shoulders of the psychopathic bully she worked for, otherwise known as Belinda. But now, at this critical moment, poised as she was to take the action that she knew she must, her certainty had suddenly left her. As she sat there, pen in hand, trying to put her feelings into words, other memories kept flashing randomly into her mind, each one earlier in her life than the last. Each time she thought she had it pinned down and figured out, another image would pop up to confuse her. Flash was her first day here in this job. She was meeting Belinda for the first time and thinking how nice she seemed and how excited she was to be starting her childcare career. Flash. She was getting fired again and again from the many office jobs she had tried to hold down before discovering her true calling. Flash. She felt that horrible rush of blood to the head and that sick feeling in the pit of her stomach as she stared at her appalling exam results and dreaded the dismal future that lay ahead of her. Flash. She was saying goodbye to her family and the few friends that she had and getting ready to board the plane that would take her to the other side of the planet forever. Look, Australia is a fantastic country, and it's an amazing place to live for those people who are lucky enough to have been born and raised here. But Rachel hadn't been. She'd been born and raised in a large city in the north of England, and as much as she loved it in Australia, she'd never beaten the homesickness. Oh, she tried to work it all out, and in fact, it had become something of an obsession with her over the last few weeks, and she got the idea from somewhere that if she could just figure out who was to blame for her current situation, things might just start to improve. She couldn't even think straight anymore, which was just another problem she had to worry about. The only thing worse than losing your mind is knowing that it's happening. Rachel truly believed with all her heart that Belinda was actually the devil, and at the same time she knew it couldn't possibly be true. Although she wasn't a religious person, she very firmly believed now that there was someone up there watching her, guiding her life, and that he absolutely hated her and delighted in taking away everything from her and putting obstacle and after obstacle in her path. Once, some Jehovah's Witnesses had come to the door, and they'd been subjected to a rage-filled tirade about how God was a sadistic bully and she didn't want to hear anything about him before she finally slammed the door in their faces. Afterwards, it occurred to her that this had been a bit over the top, very disrespectful and just a little bit, well, insane. And she felt guilty and ashamed. Nobody ever came to their door trying to sell religion anymore, even when they went to every other house on the street. Rachel had watched them walk up and down the cul-de-sac, very deliberately avoiding number 6. Obviously, word had got around, and they had been warned to stay away from the angry atheist. Well, she would just have to try and get her head straight now if she wanted to have any hope of getting these words right. And it was very important, now more than ever, to get the words right. People had to know. It occurred to her at this point that this was all probably just another stalling tactic. By procrastinating over this final task, she was just putting off the inevitable. It really wasn't very surprising that it had come to this. In her heart of hearts, she had always known that it would eventually. She'd even tried it before. But just like everything else in her life, her previous attempts had all been spectacular failures. She always seemed to chicken out. She was such a coward. There was always some lame excuse not to go through with it. Well, not this time. This time it had to work. There was no other way out now. She knew she was losing her mind, and the anger had been building for weeks. Now she was really worried that it might just erupt at any time without warning, and some innocent person would end up paying the price for what had been done to her. She couldn't let that happen. She had to get out. Everywhere she looked, she saw people living their lives. They had jobs, they got married, they had babies. Even her younger brother was married now, with 2 children, a mortgage, a couple of cars. Rachel was 35 and still living at home with Mum and Dad. It really wasn't fair. It's not as though she was asking for very much. Other people might beg the universe to send them great beauty or make them fantastically rich or famous. Rachel wasn't asking for any of that. All she wanted was to be normal. How difficult could that be? Other people had normality, why couldn't she? Just one thing. That's all she wanted, just one thing, for God's sake. But she had nothing at all. She wasn't pretty or smart or funny or good at making friends. She had no particular skills. She couldn't draw, sing, dance. And there was the tremor. It had always been there throughout her whole life. It's just shaky hands. It was quite mild, but it had stopped her from being able to do some things that other people just seemed to take for granted. And of course, it had provided fodder for the bullies. She'd never been able to hold down a job, with the exception of her current one, from which there now seemed to be no escape. And now, the worst thing. She just found out that the one thing she'd always clung to, the one hope, the fact that as a woman, she had the power to create life, that had been taken away from her now. That had been the last straw. That last visit to the doctor had broken her beyond repair. Things had always been bad for Rachel since she was 4 years old, but she'd always held on to the tiny glimmer of hope that she could look forward to leaving school, when she had assumed that the bullying would stop. But it never had. If anything, it had got worse. The kids at school had been bad enough, but when it comes to cruelty, adults are far more inventive and effective. Well, she was sick of it now. Quite literally sick of it. The half-hour drive to work every day tied her stomach in knots and made her want to vomit. She had a permanent headache from the constant crying and the sleepless nights. She was also sure, although she couldn't actually prove it, that her recent medical problems had been brought on by the stress of her situation, and that meant Belinda was to blame. She never went straight home after work these days. Instead, she drove to the home of her one and only friend Richard every night, so that her parents wouldn't see that she'd been crying all the way. She wasn't exactly sure why she was so scared to show her parents that she had feelings. They had raised her well, and had never made her feel like she should be ashamed of her emotions. That's just how she felt, like feelings should be hidden away, and the world should believe that nothing was wrong. Richard never questioned her too much, even when she showed up at his house with puffy eyes and a tear-stained face. He knew she was not coping, and he really wanted to help her, but he also knew that talking about it just made her feel worse, and he had enough sensitivity not to push it. Occasionally he would drop some random comment into the conversation, such as, if you ever want to talk, I'm always here. But then he'd just leave it at that, and he wouldn't force the issue. Sometimes Rachel wished that he would force it, but at the same time, and she was terrified about what might come out if she was pushed over the edge. Another random flashback came to her now. She was back at school, being teased, bullied, picked on, as she always had been. Maybe if she hadn't had to go through all that, she might be stronger now, better able to cope with Belinda. That dream popped into her head at this point, and she actually jumped when she was sure that she heard the creature growling right next to her. As she sat there, trembling, scared to look around, she fought desperately to come up with a train of thought that would distract her from the certain knowledge that she was about to be attacked and eaten by a gigantic murderous bear dog. All she could think about was the first night she had had that dream, and the awful day that had led up to it.